Welcome to the Hillsdale College Online Courses Podcast. I am Jeremiah Regan.
And I'm Juan. We're back with the Federalist, lecture number 9, The President.
There's an interesting argument in the Federalist, and Dr. Pestritto brings this out nicely in the lecture. When you read Article 2 of the Constitution, the first word is the. The executive power is vested in a president of the United States. And this is something that was very clear at the time of the founding, and it's eroded a lot today. And we'll just sum it up in simple terms. The president should be able to hire, sometimes with the advice and consent of the Senate, depending on the office, should be able to hire people to help him, and should be able to fire people that he thinks are inadequate for the job. The idea being he has to have control over his branch of the government. The people elected him, put him in charge of that branch, not the whole government, he's not the king, but he should have authority over his own branch. And the 20th and 21st century has seen a history of that power. The president's ability to hire and fire within his own branch eroded dramatically.
Yeah, I've been encouraged by seeing a resurgence in this understanding of the executive power nowadays. You know, you see people on TV always talking about that the Department of Justice needs to be independent from the president. And I always think to myself, under what branch of government is the Department of Justice?
If the Department of Justice is going to be independent from the president, that means it's independent from the will of the American people.
That's right. So you actually want it to be under the president. It is under the president, and the president is the one in whom, like you said, all of executive authority is vested on that person.
Dr. Pestritto makes an excellent explication of this argument, and we encourage you to not only listen to the podcast, but also read along with Dr. Pestritto for yourself. To make that easy, we have the Federalist, the Liberty Fund Gideon edition of the Federalist, available at hillsdale.edu/course. That's hillsdale.edu/course. Go and pick up your own copy of the Federalist, read it, mark it up, and cherish it.
Honestly, if you don't have a copy of the Federalist, you should have it. It is one of the best explanations of the Constitution, of our form of government. Once you read it, well, you'll be really enlightened and in a sense, humbled by the intellect of the founders, of the people that put together our Constitution. So if you haven't read the Federalist and if you don't own a copy, you should definitely do that. And you can do that by going to hillsdale.edu/course.
Now let's turn to Dr. Pestritto with Lecture 9 of the Federalist, The President.
In our previous session, we discussed the president and how the president, along with the Senate, was an important part of how Publius provides a balance between a more direct, intimate dependence on public opinion on the one hand, and accountability to the long-term, stable public reason on the other hand. And we're going to continue looking at the president in this session, and we're going to turn to his control over the administrative apparatus of the national government. To begin, we need first to understand a point that was so important for Publius and so obvious for Publius, and it's a point that is so badly misunderstood today that one could even say that the way we conceive of this feature of the presidency and this feature of our national administration is almost exactly the opposite of what Publius intended and what's actually in the Constitution. And this fundamental idea was that the president must control administration. Administration and administrators cannot be independent of the president. And in fact, Publius would have considered the idea that there can be an independent administrative class to be totally incompatible with the principle of republicanism. If you think about most of what our government does today, it's mostly administrative. We know that the scope and the activity of our national government has greatly enlarged, especially since the advent of the 20th century. And now all of these new roles and new features of the federal government make it virtually impossible for Congress itself to make all of the specific rules and regulations that would be needed to govern. And so instead, Congress has created a large set of administrative agencies in order to help come up with the rules and the regulations and in order to aid the president in the execution of the laws. And in a way, that's all administration really is. And there's nothing novel about administration or nothing inherently bad about administration. Every government must have it. It simply means how the laws are executed, how the laws are carried out, how the policies of the government are carried out. So we have this administrative apparatus that does most of the executing of our laws. Where is it located? In our system, under the Constitution, the administration is done by the president. The president is given the duty in Article 2 of the Constitution to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. So administration is the president's job. Now, we know, of course, that the president can't actually carry out the specific administration of all the laws in person. He has individuals in the executive branch who do that, and they do that theoretically in a way that is accountable to him, because nobody else in government is given administrative power, is given executive power. And remember, the national government is a government of enumerated powers. That means it only has those powers that are granted to it by the Constitution. The authority of administrative agencies, the authority of the bureaucracy, that has to be constitutionally granted somewhere. And clearly in our system, it's under the executive. That's Article 2 of the Constitution. But we should consider the language of the Constitution very carefully here. What one individual is granted the executive power by the Constitution? That's the president. Article 2 says the executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States, nobody else. Therefore, all administrative action in the national government must ultimately flow from this grant of constitutional authority to the president. This means that these administrators exercise their power only under the umbrella of the presidency. And that means only in a way that the president approves of and only in the manner that he directs. Or at least that's supposed to be the way that it works. And that's certainly Publius's vision of it, which you get in the papers on the presidency, and especially in paper number 70. This basic and very obvious fact from the Federalist and from the Constitution actually runs counter to an understanding that is prevalent in our politics today, really on both sides of the partisan divide. And that is the idea that administrators are supposed to be independent of the president. In fact, nominees to federal agencies are routinely asked by legislators from both parties if they will pledge to be independent of the president if they are confirmed to their office.
A number of different ways. I believe, regardless of who or what outside the department is trying to influence what's going on, every decision within the department relating to enforcement, the Attorney General has to determine independently that it's a lawful action. And if there was a lawful bona fide investigation that someone was trying to squelch, I wouldn't tolerate that.
And so if these nominees are faithful to that pledge, if they are independent of the president, then exactly whom are they dependent on? Certainly not to voters. Remember, administrators don't run for office. They're not subject to popular supervision in the way that members of Congress are or the president is. The only way in which our system of administration is kept Republican is because it is made accountable to a president who is elected. So the idea we have that prevails today doesn't actually sound very democratic when we reflect on it, does it? Yet it seems the very individuals who worry so much in the public press about threats to our democracy are often the same ones who favor the power of administrative agencies and who like to see administrators be able to rule independently from public control. Publius, it turns out, from long ago, is far more democratic than the ideas that often prevail today. He seems more concerned with our democracy and with the threats to our democracy than today's political class. Publius understands very well, as all of our framers would have understood, that if you have parts of the executive that are not accountable to the president, that are somehow separate from the president, then you have parts of the executive that are not accountable to the Constitution. This point is the overriding emphasis of the Federalist Papers on the presidency and is a special point of emphasis in number 70, which is an account of and a defense of what is called the unitary nature of our executive. In Federalist 70, Publius is attempting to explain why it would be a bad idea to have a plural executive. And this may sound like an odd concept to us because we're so accustomed to a unitary executive. But in fact, having a plural executive was fairly common at this time. Many states had plural executives. All we mean by a plural executive is more than one person or more than one office holder is granted by the Constitution some share of the executive power. In fact, many states today have plural executives. If you're from a state where not only the governor is elected, but where maybe the attorney general is elected or the insurance commissioner is elected, then you're in a state that has a plural executive. And so the question for Publius in number 70 is, why don't we do the same with the national executive? Wouldn't that be safer? After all, one way of making power safe is to divide it. That's a practice Publius has undertaken in many other respects. Why not divide executive authority? And his answer to that question is twofold in number 70. First, he says, the nature of executive power is such that it often has to be exercised quickly, decisively. If you're going to involve a group of people in trying to make a quick decision, it could even be in the most critical emergency of the state, as Publius puts it. And remember, this is before the age of nuclear weapons. It's going to be very difficult to get a group of people to come to a quick decision. Any of you who've been part of a committee that has had to come up with some decision will know what I'm talking about. And so unity leads to efficiency, leads to decisiveness, leads to speed. And that's a quality that you need in the executive. Remember, that's very different than what we want out of the legislative branch. Separation of powers isn't only a good thing because it pits different branches against one another and checks their ambitions. That's one advantage. But another advantage is it assigns particular powers to particular branches that are best suited to exercising those powers. You want legislation, which is general, to be deliberate. You want it to come out of a slow process of consideration, whereas executive power requires a very different kind of action. It requires often responding to circumstances which present themselves immediately and need an immediate response. And that speaks for unity. So that's reason number one. Reason number two is the even more important reason, and it goes to this basic point we've been making about the need for all administration to come under the control of the president. Publius says in number 70 that if you didn't have a unitary executive, you wouldn't have accountability. Voters wouldn't be able to supervise executive power. They wouldn't know whom to blame. Now, executive power, being a very different thing than legislative power, often the voters have to come in after the fact. When you elect the chief executive, you're trusting that person's judgment. You know there are going to be circumstances that arise where they have to exercise their discretion. You're not going to get to intervene and tell them what to do. But that judgment is often exercised after the fact. And Publius says, if you have a plural executive, hey, these guys are politicians, they're really talented at blaming somebody else. And so when you have a measure that the public will want to hold an executive to account for, you have to know who did it. And you can only have that kind of Republican accountability if there's a single person in charge and you know that that single person can be held to account.
Hey there! Today I want to tell you about the Hillsdale K-12 Classical Education Podcast. This unique show explains how children benefit from an American classical education. Whether you're a teacher, student, or parent, you'll find something of value on the show. You'll hear from teachers and administrators from schools around the country, as well as Hillsdale professors and friends who are leading the effort to revive the American tradition of K-12 education. When you listen, you'll learn all about classical education, what it is, how to teach it, and why it matters today. And there are dozens of back episodes on specific topics, like teaching Singapore math, reading great books, and even understanding how athletics is critical to a child's development. Listen every Monday on podcast.hillsdale.edu. That's podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you find your audio.
The way Publius puts it in number 70 is to say, One of the weightiest objections to a plurality in the executive is that it tends to conceal faults and destroy responsibility. This accountability is vital in the Constitution's design of the executive. One of the objections that Publius is addressing himself to in this section of the book is the assertion by some of the anti-federalists that you really can't have a firm, energetic executive in a republic, that those two ideas are incompatible. You can either have a republic or you can have an energetic executive, but not both. That's the anti-federalist view. Publius's counter to that is to say we must have an energetic executive. That's essential not only in a republic, but in any government, in order for it to function properly. Remember, one of the great criticisms of government under the Articles from Federalist number 15 was that it lacked an executive power. It relied on the voluntary cooperation of those who were to be the objects of federal legislation. So we have to have a vigorous, energetic executive. We have to have the ability of the national government to enforce the laws which the Constitution authorizes it to make. The Federalists know this is a significant power, and this is very dangerous, and this has to be guarded against constitutionally. And the very best guard, really the only guard you can have on that in a republic, is the people themselves. The fact that they can hold the executive accountable. Well, if you have large swaths of major kinds of executive power that are not subject to popular supervision, that are not under, therefore, the authority of the president, you really can't make an energetic executive responsible and Republican. So if, for example, as a voter, you have a powerful agency, let's say like the Federal Reserve or the Federal Trade Commission, and you don't like the decisions that those agencies have made, if you don't want to consent to them, where do you go to exercise your control? Where do you go to exercise your input? You can't just vote for a different president because the president actually cannot remove the heads of those agencies. So this point about executive control over administration comes in the midst of a series of papers where Publius is making the case that in a republic, we have to have an energetic executive, but we have to have that energy made safe for republicanism, and that's going to be done through specific forms of the Constitution. And so now we want to look at some of the specific forms he talks about in number 70, 71, 72, and 73. What is it that can make an executive both energetic but also safe in a constitutional republic? Publius talks about 5 key features of the executive in these papers. Unity in number 70, which we have already outlined. Duration in number 71, meaning the length of the president's term. Re-eligibility in number 72, and that means no term limits on the presidency. Remember that term limits only came in with the 22nd Amendment after the presidency of Franklin Roosevelt. And then what Publius calls adequate measures of support and also competent powers, and both of those are discussed in number 73. And just to address each of those briefly, in number 70, which we've already talked about, the defense of having a unitary executive is speed, decisiveness, and also accountability. In number 71, which you'll recall we have talked about in a previous session, one of the reasons for a longer term is so that the president can be responsible, so that he doesn't have to be a slave either to public opinion or to the legislature, that with a 4-year term, he has a little bit of ability to resist immediate irrational demands. The way Publius puts it is to say that it's necessary to give the president a little personal firmness in office. You want the president to have a stake in his presidency. Remember, the separation of power system works because each officer is willing to defend his constitutional turf against the invasions of the other branches. Well, if you're a president and you're only going to be there for, let's say, 6 months or a year or some really short time, and then you've got to lay down your office and maybe go back to the legislature where you're going to make most of your career, you might not be as willing, you might not be as interested in defending the prerogatives of the presidency against the legislature. Here, by giving the president a longer term, you make the interests of the man coincide with the duties of the office. That's the way Madison puts it in 51. And that's a big argument for duration, or for the 4-year term. In re-eligibility, in saying that we shouldn't put term limits on the president, here again, the basic principle is accountability to the voters. What do we call a president now who is in his second term? We call them a lame duck. As soon as a president wins re-election to a second term, that president knows he will not face the voters again. So if the president is going to be in office for 8 years, fully half of that time, he will be serving as somebody who knows he's not going to be held to account to the voters. And from Publius's point of view, as he explains in number 72, that would be un-Republican. There are a couple of other reasons that Publius points to in number 72 as reasons for re-eligibility. He says experience can be useful. If the public approves of a president's conduct, why not gain the advantage of an executive who is experienced from long service? As long as they could throw the executive out if they don't approve, you can take advantage of that experience. And finally, you don't want to deprive the public of its ability to retain the same president, especially in times of an emergency. You don't want to force ever a public to change up executive leadership in what might be a very critical moment for the country. Finally, in number 73, Publius turns to what he calls an adequate measure of support. And here he simply means salary. You don't want the executive to be dependent on the legislature for his pay. This is an important part of ensuring his independence. You want him to exercise his executive power in a way that keeps the legislature within its constitutional bounds. Well, how effective would the president be at doing this if the legislature could wave around the threat of removing or greatly reducing his compensation? The other feature of the presidency that Federal 73 talks about is the veto. And we should look a little carefully at how Publius explains this, because Publius conceives of the veto in two important ways. When we think of a presidential veto, we almost surely think of that as a policy tool, that this is a way in which a presidential administration can make Congress negotiate on framing national policy. So when Congress makes a law, it knows that it has to go and present that law to the president and get his approval, or else that law will not go into effect. And so that's a way in which the president can make himself almost a partner in legislation. And that's very common in our present practice of government. But the main reason for having a presidential veto that Publius talks about came out of the experience the Federalists had with the practice of state government in the 1780s, where you had these overactive state legislatures, and where, except for states like New York, the governors had little or no power to check legislative excesses. And so here Publius is thinking of the veto as what one might call a constitutional self-defense mechanism. Here's how he puts it in Federalist 73. The propensity of the legislative department to intrude upon the rights and to absorb the powers of the other departments has been already more than once suggested. The insufficiency of a mere parchment delineation of the boundaries of each has also been remarked upon, and the necessity of furnishing each with constitutional arms for its own defense has been inferred and proved. So it's interesting the way he puts that. He doesn't want a mere parchment delineation. This is in reference to the earlier discussion of the separation of powers, where Publius had explained that it's not enough in a constitution just to write down on paper what it is the legislature may do, what it is the executive may do, because the only real barrier there is simply the paper that those words are written on. The veto is there to give arms for defense, to give a real tool for defense, to give teeth to what's on paper. And that's the thing that was missing, in Publius's opinion, from most of the state constitutions. So that's the basic purpose of a veto, constitutional self-defense. One example might be, let's say, when President Nixon vetoed the War Powers Resolution, when Congress came and passed a law which said, we're going to define the circumstances under which you get to exercise one of your constitutional powers. And the president's view was, hey, wait a minute, I get my power from the same place you get your power. I get my power from the Constitution itself. And a co-equal branch doesn't get to tell me how I'm going to exercise that power. And so President Nixon vetoed the War Powers Resolution as a kind of constitutional self-defense mechanism. Now, that veto was overridden, as the story goes, but in any event, that was the thinking, that was the logic.
As far as my own views are concerned, I believe, as I indicated in my veto message, that the War Powers Act is unconstitutional. But what is even more important, I believe that it is very bad public policy.
Having said that, Publius does contemplate other uses of the veto. And in particular, he contemplates the use of the veto when the president believes that Congress has enacted a bad law. And this makes it somewhat more akin to what one might call a policy veto, or where the president uses a veto to influence the policy of the country. Here's how Publius puts it in 73. The power in question has a further use. It not only serves as a shield to the executive, but it furnishes an additional security against the enaction of improper laws. So certainly if, in the judgment of the president, Congress has passed an imprudent or an ill-advised law, in Publius's view, the veto is there to be used in order to check that. The way Publius ends up describing what we're calling a policy veto is really, it's a way of the president being able to make sure that Congress deliberates sufficiently. The president himself cannot make a law, but he can make sure that Congress deliberates well when Congress makes laws. So if these are all ways of making an energetic executive safe for republicanism, they're also not the only ways in which our Constitution attempts to safeguard the rights of citizens. We also have a branch that we haven't said much about up to this point, the judiciary. We also have the Bill of Rights. And in our next and final session, we're going to turn our attention to those things.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Hillsdale College Online Courses Podcast. If you want to continue learning, please visit hillsdale.edu/course. There, you will find over 40 free online courses including Ancient Christianity, the Genesis story, classic children's literature, and many more. The courses include additional readings, study guides, fully produced videos, and you can chat with your fellow students on a dedicated forum. Upon completing a course, you will also get a certificate. All our courses are free because we believe that what you'll learn will enrich your life and that a virtuous citizen is the best defense for liberty. So pursue the education necessary for freedom and happiness at hillsdale.edu/course today. That's hillsdale.edu/course. Thanks for listening.